Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Naglieri, and in this half-hour session, I'm going to talk about identification of gifted children as a social justice issue, and I'll raise a number of issues, problems, and provide you with solutions. So this will be a session where we'll look at what needs to be done, what has been done, and how well it works. So it's a good message, I think. Much of what I'm going to say is on my website, so feel free to go there to get additional information. Also, take a look at my webinars and articles that appear there. And of course, some disclosures on the right-hand side of the screen. I like to start off with my conclusions because I think it helps people understand why I talk about different topics as we go through today. So here's the big picture. Gifted identification. What have we done for many, many years, whether it's a COGAT or a WISC or a Stanford Binet? We have evaluated students' ability using tests that are verbal, like vocabulary and information and things like that, so-called nonverbal, like block design or matrices, and quantitative with things like arithmetic. Sometimes we call it working memory, sometimes we call it verbal reasoning, and so on. But the basic elements of what we use are verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative. And the directions that we give have many verbal concepts. Many times, not only do the content of the questions demand knowledge, but the answers to the questions require verbal expression, of course. This puts students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds at disadvantage. And many Black and Hispanic students and Native American students and ELL students have been denied entry to gifted education because of the content of the tests and the way the tests require students to respond. So that's the big picture. But here's the good thing. We can do better. There is a solution, actually several solutions. So here's the outline for the next 28 minutes. Traditional intelligence tests, we'll review some of the content issues. We'll talk about intelligence testing as a social justice issue and talk about the difference between bias and equity, for example. We'll talk about intelligence tests that are used. What are the ones that are most often used? And importantly, what do they measure? And then we'll talk about how we can improve on a traditional approach to measuring intelligence in a way that is equitable. And I'll share with you some research that involves 3 separate studies with a total of over 8,000 students that shows, in fact, we can do better. We can do better. So a little bit on test equity. So in 1975, I started working at this school as a school psychologist, Champaign Elementary School in Bethpage, New York. And I did what I was taught to do, which was to give a WISC and give an achievement test. And I noticed that the questions on the WISC were very similar to the question on the achievement test. And it didn't make sense to me, but I did what I was taught to do. In 1977, when I was a student of Alan Kaufman's, I'm at the University of Georgia for my PhD program, Alan suggested that the verbal part of the WISC was really achievement. And that made perfect sense to me because I had already experienced that. As a university professor myself in Northern Arizona, in Flagstaff, not far from the Second Mesa, where we would evaluate Native American Navajo students, it became abundantly clear to me that it was really ridiculous to give a WISC to a Native American student who gets a low score on the verbal side And people would say, well, that's because their left brains aren't developed sufficiently. That was ridiculous. So in my first paper on this whole issue of content of intelligence tests was in 1982. Does the WISC-R measure verbal intelligence for non-English speaking children? Answer, no. In 1985, I published my first nonverbal test, then called matrix analogies test, which was really similar to what I did for the Kaufmans on their KBC and what had been done previously by Raven, which became my Naglieri nonverbal ability test. Now, several years later, actually more than a decade later, I published my Essentials of CAS assessment, again with an emphasis on fair assessment. 2003, I published a paper with Donna Ford where we showed that a nonverbal test could help deal with the problem of underrepresentation of minority children and gifted. 2009, I published a book with my colleagues Kim Lansdowne and Dina Bruyes with the same emphasis on fairness. And later on this year, in the summer of 21, Dina and Kim and I will publish 3 tests that I'll show you. And these instruments also meet our goal of fair assessment. So let's take a few steps. This presentation is about gifted children, but it's important to explain, what do I mean by that? Gifted children are those who are really smart. Talented students are those who are knowledgeable. You can be gifted and not knowledgeable. You can be really talented and not really necessarily gifted because you have a lot of advantages. And the interesting question is, how many children, gifted children, are there in our country? Well, I did a little math and got population statistics. And even though organizations like the National Association of Gifted Children talk about top 10% as being gifted, I just used top 8%. And I calculated how many white, Black, Hispanic, Native American students and so on are in the US, how many are potentially gifted, how many are actually in gifted and talented programs. And what I found was that 848,000 non-white students are smart enough to be in gifted, but haven't been let in. And one of the big obstacles of the tests that we use. So let's take a closer look at that. The tests that we use, why do they look the way they look? Well, in order to know that, you need to look at the history. That means you need to go back 100 years and read about the Army Mental Testing Program. These men developed the tests that are used in all of the traditional IQ tests. The Wechsler, they borrowed from Binet, so Binet as well, which was before this, of course, and then with differential ability scales, and the Woodcock, and really in some parts of the KBC, these men developed the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. Now, the Alpha was verbal stuff and arithmetic. The Beta was so-called nonverbal stuff. Wechsler, who was in the US military and who was an examiner using these tests, borrowed from the Alpha and the Beta to make his verbal and performance or nonverbal tests. And that same influence led to the Kogat and the Otis Lennon, and still is in the WISC, even though Pearson is trying to come up with all different ways of interpreting things differently. And we still have nonverbal. Now, why do they have a nonverbal scale? In 1920, Yoakum Yerkes explicitly wrote, men who fail in Alpha are sent to Beta in order that injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English may be avoided. There's no mention of measuring verbal and nonverbal intelligences, and importantly, the inclusion of test questions that required knowledge, and especially knowledge of English, was considered a social justice issue 100 years ago. If you look at the standards for educational and psychological tests, they make it very, very clear that if a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content of an intelligence test, that test can be considered unfair, even if the test does not show psychometric test bias. So this is the essence of equitable assessment, having test items that everyone have equal opportunity to respond to. Now, there's a really interesting court case that you should be aware of, U46 court case in Elgin, Illinois, where the school district of 42% Hispanics, but only 2% of gifted were in kids were in the Hispanic. Only 2% of gifted kids were Hispanic. The policies and procedures used by the school district was the COGAT and verbal and math test scores and my Naglieri nonverbal. But what they did is they required everybody to have high scores on the verbal and achievement stuff, even though they had a high score on the nonverbal. And the judge ruled that the district intentionally discriminated against Hispanic students. That has implications for us as school psychologists. Now, let's take a look at intelligence tests and eligibility. What are we using? Well, according to a recent research study, a survey of all the tests that are used, you can see the COGAT and the WISC are the two most widely used, followed by the WJ, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which is just an achievement test, and the Otis Lennon. Of those top 6 tests that are used, only the Naglieri nonverbal is one that is not confounded by knowledge. All these other tests are. This is the essence of a social justice problem in the field of gifted. Now, what do we know about these intelligence tests? Like the Binet, like the WISC, they yield big differences, for example, by race. Whereas tests like my Naglieri nonverbal yields this, and the cognitive assessment system, by the way, yields the smallest difference. So it's very, very clear that these traditional tests are posing an equity problem for identification of gifted children. I showed years ago with Donna Ford that a nonverbal test, mine, identified equal proportion of white, Black, and Hispanic students. So the idea of taking knowledge out of the measurement of ability clearly works. Interestingly, in a recent study done by Melissa Durchie, she looked at Black, Hispanic, and white children on the COGAT and found considerable problems with the COGAT, that the COGAT was not identifying Black and Hispanic children. And identification rates, just like I found that I explored with Donna Ford, although we found similar rates on the COGAT, they didn't. This is all the evidence that we know about the COGAT because COGAT authors have never released any research on Black-white differences on that instrument. So interestingly, let's go back in history. Nearly 100 years, Rudolf Pintner wrote, "A good intelligence test must avoid anything commonly learned. To ask the question, who discovered America, sound familiar? Would be indicative of school progress or general cultural environment, not general intelligence. Arithmetical reasoning, frankly, educational, do not differ from achievement tests." I'm not saying anything new at all. And remember, all these tests were really based on the concept of general intelligence, which was really what Wexler and Pintner have been talking about for many years. But interesting, Rudolf Pintner said explicitly that they didn't have a clear definition of what a general intelligence was. And they're still trying to give it greater scientific support. We see that every day. Now, remember that Wechsler's definition was the global aggregate of the individual to act purposefully, think rationally, deal effectively with his environment. Kind of sexist there, but nevertheless. And even when you read Kaufman in the foreword to the Wechsler nonverbal scale, which I am the author of, what Kaufman said very clearly was that Wechsler never thought verbal and performance scales measured different abilities. They were just different ways of getting at general intelligence. In other words, verbal and nonverbal referred to the content of the test, not the kind of thinking. All right, now, something really important. There's a lot of research recently looking at traditional IQ tests and asking the question, what's the most important score that the test yields? And what's been found by Gary Canavay and Dubronsky and Molly Watkins and Ryan McGill, people that I know and respect, is that the total score that represents general intelligence is the score that should be used. And the part scores don't have enough specific variance for all traditional intelligence tests, except the CAS, by the way. In any case, in our book, we help people understand that the concept of general ability is a vague notion. It's just like a foundational ability. Okay, a few more steps. Improving traditional intelligence tests. I started working on this several years ago with colleagues, and what we wanted to do was retain the original notion of verbal and nonverbal and quantitative, but make it equitable. And how we would do that was the challenge. But I had some ideas. And one of the ideas was to take the language out of the test instructions and out of the student response and take formal knowledge out of the items. Verbal and quantitative items is what I'm talking about here. So we created a verbal test that could be solved using any language. The test is actually based on the neuropsychological concept from A.R. Luria of called the superfluous fourth. We created a quantitative test that doesn't require language and another nonverbal matrices test. I'll show you what these look like. Now, what was our purpose? Our purpose was to measure how a person thinks in a way that's not confounded by what they know. Just like Pintner said, a good intelligence test should not be confounded by knowledge. So, what do these tests look like? Well, the verbal measures. The verbal tests I mentioned were modeled after a neuropsychological concept that Luria talked about, which is the concept he called superfluous fourth. And if you read in Luria's book, especially Language and Cognition, which I think is one of the best books about Luria, he describes how he would measure the concept orally by asking a person, what word doesn't go with the other? Here are the four words: rose, daisy, stem, tulip. Which word doesn't go with the others? Rose, daisy, stem, tulip. Well, three of those are what? A flower, and stem is not a flower, it's part of a flower. So we understood that, as Luria describes, language has many dimensions. Like language could designate a particular thing like a flower, or an attribute like the color of a flower, or an action like a ball rolling down a hill, or a relationship like a boy standing behind a girl. So we developed a test where the students look at 6 pictures and they need to decide which one doesn't go with the others. So the verbal concept test really is what it is, and relationships among images. Now, the really cool thing was we decided to create animated instructions. So I'll play this animation for you. Hopefully, here it comes. So we zoom out. This indicates thinking on the part of the child. That this is illustrating these things go together and that one doesn't. The verbal concept being fruit or things you can eat. And then the animation clicks the wrong one first so you can see how to change your answer and then advance to the next item. We just gave directions to a student about a verbal task without ever saying a word. Now, what about the nonverbal? The nonverbal test is similar to the ones that I've done in the past, but I actually created new kinds of matrices. And I'm not going to show you what those are because I don't want test prep people to see them. So we're keeping those very close to the vest, so to speak. So we have nonverbal measure. And again, we have an animation, the same kind of approach. In this case, the thought bubble brings the child to the top part, which is basically the question, the options, the selection, and then the response, just like I showed you a few moments ago. Now, what about the quantitative test? So the quantitative test is intentionally non-verbal. So we look a lot at relationships, like, for example, in this 1, 2, 3, obviously 4. This is a matrix, right? This is just like, having 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares, question mark. The difference between 1 and 3 and 2, these relationships all need to be deciphered in order to arrive at the answer. So the animated instructions for this shows another kind of item that we have, which is a balance beam. So the child needs to look at that relationship. Okay, 2 triangles equals 1 equals 2 circles. So 1 triangle equals 1 circle. It's basic quantitative thinking. That's what we're getting at here. Now, does it work? This is a really important question because I, as a researcher and as a test author, I don't want to suggest that any instrument should be used in any context if there's not ample evidence that that suggestion is supported by science. So I've always had this approach with all of my tests. They have to be shown to be effective if I'm going to suggest they be used in one way or another. That's why when I published my Naglieri nonverbal, we did so much research to show that it is, in fact, appropriate across race and ethnicity and so on and so forth. Same thing with my cognitive assessment system. I provide evidence that it works. And this study is actually 3 studies in one. So we have replication. So the replication is important. So what we did here is we tested 3 groups of people from kindergartners to 12th graders with a verbal test, another group of people with a nonverbal test and a quantitative. So about 2,500 kids got the verbal, about 3,600 got the nonverbal, and about 2,800 got the quantitative. So 3 different samples. That means we're replicating our study 3 times. And what's our question? Our question is, can we take out the knowledge out of these measures of general ability and make tests that are equitable? And the answer is most definitely. We found little to no differences across race, little to no difference across ethnicity, Hispanics, non-Hispanics, and so on, and no gender differences. But the really important one was no parental education level differences. That's really powerful. So this is over 8,000 people who represent the US population. This is a manuscript we submitted for publication. And I think this is proof of concept, that this is an idea that really makes sense. And we know we can measure general ability using these 3 tests with good reliability, which is always important. We have good, reliable measures. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to hear from you. I'm happy to take questions from you. You can email me. You can certainly go to my website. There's a lot of information there. I encourage you to do that. But if you want to email me, please do so. And I want to close with this particular slide. This is a statement by Martin Luther King at the Martin Luther King Memorial. I live right near Washington, D.C., and was there recently. And I love this message. Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of our country, and a finer world to live in. So I hope that you have a good conference. And I'll just add with one more thing, one more thought. You know, we are in this pandemic and we're all doing the best we can to manage the difficulty. And I guess, you know, the only good thing is that we know at some point the pandemic's going to be over. But I think probably what is most important is the lesson that we teach our students and our own children and everyone else about what we can learn and how to cope with the diversity. So maybe there's something of benefit through all that we've gone through. So anyway, it's time to stop. And as I said, thank you for being here today, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future.